Chapter 12. Outside was hot and bright and noisy with traffic and conversation. He stood staring over his bare legs, feeling vulnerable. If Shiny was so concerned with him flashing, then why, he thought, why had he let him go without pants? He imagined bumping into the blonde again, maybe a gust of wind striking him, and then puff, the t-shirt was over his head. Then Sammy coming to save the day and catching him again, dragging him back to cell 5 with his putrid fishy hands, maybe bunking him up with Maniac in the penthouse suite. With that in mind, he kept one hand on his t-shirt and walked awkwardly down the police station steps. His flip-flops made slapping noises nearing the bottom. He saw John and Andrew on the street curb. Cars whizzed past them. They argued, shouting over each other. "No, no, no," John was saying. "You cracked an egg on my head. You deserved that beating."
"Yeah, but I wasn't ready," Andrew said. "I'd have you now, you fat jabber."
Neither noticed Anders coming. He jumped off the last step and stood over them smiling.
"Still arguing, are we?"
John stood up, rubbing his hands together, staring at Anders in his ridiculously sized t-shirt. Andrew stayed on the curb. He looked at the flip-flops and leaned back slightly.
"Glad to see you both,"
Anders said, stepping closer. "Wow, not that close," John said. "You stink like shit." Andrew got up now. He stood behind John and lifted his vest over his nose, pinning it there with the back of his wrist.
"What the hell happened to you?" he asked. "Your legs and arms look as though they've been through a pencil sharpener, and..." He paused, lowered his vest to speak more clearly. "Don't get me started on your outfit."
He paused then, his mouth closed. He blinked rapidly.
"Oh, that stench,"
he added quickly. Anders was laughing as they set off. He walked behind them, making sure his t-shirt covered his privates, pulling on it with both hands.
"I've had an awful morning. My cell stunk worse than me," he said, trying to catch up. What an awful thing to be locked up."
He glanced back over his shoulder, looked at the grey stone building behind him, hoped he'd never have to see it again. "Take it easy, Mandela," John said, marching on. "You've only been locked up a few hours." They crossed a road heading for another street. Cars were beeping and someone yelled at Anders from a bus window.
"Where's your pants?"
He ignored them and began to jog. He caught up with John and Andrew, and they stood with space between them, forming the shape of a triangle. Cars kept beeping, comments followed. "This is becoming embarrassing," John said, looking at the traffic, then at Anders.
"You think so?"
Anders said. "Try being me." Turning, he saw a man in a thorn-coloured uniform. It wasn't Big D, he thought, with relief. Watching him cross the road, wondering what he was carrying. Without saying a word, the officer reached out and stuffed a paper plate into Anders' hand, turned and headed back to the station. Anders looked at the plate in deep thought, as though deciphering a cryptic code or something.
"Big D said they only do scramby."
He spoke at a whisper, staring at the egg on the plate. "What's that then?" John asked, facing Andrew. "What did he just say?"
"Scramby, something about scramby."
"Scramby?" John said. "You still pissed, lad?"
"Ask him."
Andrew shrugged his shoulders.
"He said it."
John turned, looking ready to query the word scramby, then looking down on the plate he paused. "Strange," he said, pointing a finger.
"What is?" Andrew asked. "What you getting at?"
"There's no ketchup." Andrew glanced up at the sky, as though a bird had done a dropping on his forehead.
"It's not that strange,"
he said, clicking his fingers in John's face, motioning a hand towards Anders.
"See the state of him. He looks ready for an 80s slumber party, and you find no ketchup strange." "I don't much like ketchup," Anders said. "Well, not with egg at least."
"What's he going to do with it though?" John asked. "There's no fork." Andrew broke the triangle and stepped between them. He was frowning, his mouth open ready to speak, but John was already swiping with his big arms, pushing him away. Then he looked at the plate. He put his fingers so close to the egg that he almost popped the yolk. "No fork," he said. "Andy, run back," he said. "Ask that officer for a fork." Anders picked up the egg between thumb and forefinger and smiled. "No," John said, reaching out. "Not like that, you bastard." Yolk dribbled either side of Anders' lips. The cars beeped.
The comments followed. Freak, tosser, homo. Feeling toughened by the day's events, he blocked them from his mind and continued eating the fried egg. This was nothing, he thought. Not after what I've been through. And anyway, none of these people know me. He laughed, showing his yolk-stained teeth. He began to enjoy the feeling of not caring and the look of embarrassment on John and Andrew's face. Beeping cars and nasty comments and nothing, he thought again. This isn't humiliation, he said, eating more egg. They can only get you if you let them. He smiled at his comment. He reminded himself to jot that one down later, his new philosophy. He needs to get a grip, John said. We still have an appointment to keep. We do, Andrew said. But why is he half naked? A car slowed down. A voice spoke. Put some pants on, kid. Beep beep. It was gone again. John turned his back to the traffic. He stared through a shop window. It was an electronics shop, and the TVs were going. Anders, why are you naked? He said, folding his arms and watching the TVs. Anders said nothing. He bit more egg and looked at the yolk on his fingers. Beep, beep, beep. Where's your pants? A driver yelled, extending an arm from his car window, holding his Stetson and waving it. I second that question, John said. Where are they? He turned from the TVs. Where are your clothes? Anders cleaned his lips with his tongue, tasting weed and vomit and egg. Then he stared at John. Come on now. John showed him his watch. We have an appointment. What happened? I can't remember. Anders laughed. He took more egg. I'm done with him, John said, looking at Andrew. If he wants to prat about, he can, but I'm going to the appointment. Without hanging around any longer, John set off. Don't go, Anders said with his egg flopping between his fingers. I need my clothes. John stopped but refused to turn round, looking away from the embarrassment and stench. Andrew stared at Anders, then at the egg and the dripping yolk. Then he stared at the back of John's head. My clothes, Anders said. You brought spares, yes? He smiled. He pulled a mocking face at the t-shirt he wore, then pointed at the face on the front. I need to change. John turned. Andrew was about halfway between them, and they stared at each other before Andrew spoke again. We might have forgotten, he laughed. Completely forgot. He laughed again. I mean, we all left in a hurry. Anders pointed eggy fingers at him. Enough, he said, smiling. Hand them over. He waved the plate. Having fallen for one pre-rehearsed joke already, the kilt gag, set up by Shiny and executed by Big D, Anders refused to fall for another. He waited, anticipating the crescendo, the punchline due at any moment. He thought, but nothing happened. Both just stared at each other, and the cars kept beeping. You brought them, yes? He said again, tongue working the corners of his mouth, mopping up yolk. Fetch them, please. The joke is over. Beep, beep, beep. Jason Donovan sucks! A driver yelled. Arm rested on the truck's open window. Anders nodded and waved as he passed. You, he then said, turning back to John and Andrew. One of you, doesn't matter who, just go and fetch my clothes. We have an appointment to keep. I'd like to attend wearing pants. We messed up. We've got nothing, John said, straight-faced. Now stop acting the prat. We need to go. Anders was barely listening. He bit more egg. Yummy, he said. This egg tastes good, or should I say, yumbo. Just a word I learned today. That and scramby, of course. He waved the egg above his head. Wonder why it's fried, he laughed. They only do scramby. John came back, was leaning over Andrew's shoulder now, whispering, nudging his body into him. We'll miss the appointment at this rate, he said. Have a word. With a hand covering his nose, Andrew swayed over to Anders, grabbed him by the t-shirt, and pulled him forward so they were face to face. He shook him slightly as he spoke. Honestly, now we don't have them, okay? He pushed him back and then pulled him forwards. Anders staggered unsteadily on his feet. His flip-flops slapped on the pavement, and he kept stooping forward with his mouth open and tongue extended, trying to eat more egg. But then he was pulled and pushed again, forward and back. He kept missing his mouth, skimming the egg across his cheeks, leaving streaks of yolk. Get a grip. We don't have your clothes. Are you listening? There was no response. Andrew began slapping him a little. Front hand, back hand, repeat, pull, pull, push, push. Anders' face stretched
as though cueing a yawn, and he began burping loudly. Andrew backed away, watching Anders run to the shop window where John was stood. Taking long strides, John sprung out of the way while looking over his shoulder. Anders threw the plate and the egg on the pavement. He got down onto his knees, stooping, arching his body over the plate, clutching his stomach with both hands. Retching sounds came from him. John and Andrew crouched behind, peering, getting an angle on what was going on. They saw frothy orange blobs coming from his mouth, fizzing as though someone had dropped a Barocca inside him. He caught them on the plate, sat on the pavement with bile dripping from his chin. "And that's that," John said, kicking a small rock. "That is without doubt that." He set off, marching. Cars beeped, drivers laughed at Anders, pointing at him as he stared forward now, on his hands and knees. He looked at Andrew for help, but he was following John, and he watched them disappear round a corner. Then crawling, he moved under the shop doorway and felt cold in its shade. He began shivering, tugged his t-shirt over his knees and held it there securely with a hug, rocking in the darkness, like a man suddenly gone insane.